Let me tell you something about silence. Most people think silence is weakness. They think when you don't clap back, when you don't fire off a response, when you just smile, it means you have nothing, no ammunition, no leverage, no spine. But here's what nobody tells you. Silence is the most expensive currency in the room. And I had been saving mine for a very long time. This is the story of how one man's arrogance walked him straight into the most important interview of his life. And he didn't even know he was being watched. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. It started on a Saturday. Vivian Alcott throws a garden party every year at her Connecticut estate. And if you've ever been invited, you already know. You don't say no to Vivian. The woman has a gift list that reads like a Forbes index, and a guest list that would make your knees buckle. Politicians, CEOs, old money, new money, and people like me, people who move quietly between both worlds without making a sound. I pulled up in my truck. Now, before you start forming a picture in your head, let me paint it properly. My truck is a 2003 Ford F-150, faded navy blue. One side mirror held together with electrical tape, a crack running diagonally across the lower left corner of the windshield that I kept telling Laura I'd fix and never did. The engine knocked twice before it shut off like it was clearing its throat before entering a fancy room. Blake. Her voice carried that specific tone, the one she reserved for moments when she thought I was about to do something that required her silent intervention. What? I said, completely innocent. You could have taken the Audi. The Audi's in the shop. The Audi has been in the shop for 8 months, Blake. I grinned. She's a complicated woman. Laura shook her head, gathered her clutch, and stepped out like a queen exiting a carriage. I stepped out like a man who genuinely did not care, because I genuinely did not care. We walked up the stone path toward the sound of jazz and expensive laughter, and I felt completely at home. That's the thing people never understand about me. I grew up with nothing, and somewhere along the way, nothing stopped scaring me. The party was everything Vivian's parties always are. White linen, past hors d'oeuvres that were too small to be satisfying and too pretty to complain about. A string quartet near the rose garden. 70 guests, give or take, scattered across a lawn that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. I was midway through a conversation with a retired federal judge when I heard him. Brett Weston. Now, I want to be fair here. Brett Weston is not an unintelligent man. He's actually quite sharp. The kind of sharp that comes from watching other people work hard and learning how to position yourself just close enough to take credit. He runs a mid-sized logistics company out of Stamford, drives a car whose lease payment rivals a mortgage, and has a handshake that's just a little too firm. The kind that says I need you to know I'm important before he's even told you his name. I'd met Brett twice before. Brief exchanges, nothing memorable. But apparently he remembered my truck. I heard him before I saw him. That laugh, loud, performative, designed to pull an audience. Is that a Ford F-150 out front? The Navy one? I turned slowly. Brett was standing about 12 feet away, drink in hand, Tucker Mills at his shoulder like an anxious shadow. A cluster of 6 or 7 guests had naturally orbited him, the way people orbit loud, confident energy at parties. That's mine, I said, calm, pleasant. Brett turned to face me fully. He looked me up and down, not aggressively, but with that particular brand of casual condescension that wealthy men sometimes deploy. The kind designed to make you feel like you've interrupted something. Poverty stock, he said with a smirk that he dressed up as a joke. I haven't seen one of those since my uncle's farm. Does it still run? The polite, uncertain kind of laugh people do when they're not sure if something is funny, or cruel, and don't want to be caught on the wrong side. I smiled. Not a tight smile, not a defensive smile. A genuine, relaxed, utterly unbothered smile. Every single morning, I said. Never let me down once. Brett chuckled, said something to Tucker I didn't quite catch, and the moment dissolved. The crowd drifted. The jazz kept playing. Laura appeared at my elbow with a glass of sparkling water and looked at me with one eyebrow slightly raised. You good? She asked quietly. Perfectly fine, I said. And I meant it. I was fine. But here's what I didn't tell Laura in that moment. What I couldn't tell her, actually, for reasons I'll explain. I recognized Brett Weston's company the moment he said his name. Weston Logistics, Stamford, 43 employees. $11 million annual revenue, carrying roughly $2.4 million in operational debt, and currently seeking a Series B investment from outside capital. I knew this because 3 weeks earlier, Renee Fontaine had placed Brett Weston's file on my desk. See, here's what you need to understand about what I do. I work for a private equity firm. And not just any firm, the kind that moves quietly, acquires strategically, and never ever makes the front page of anything. Sterling Hayes built it from the ground up over 20 years, and the first thing he told me when I joined was this: Blake, money is loud. Power is silent. Learn the difference. What most people don't know, what Brett Weston certainly didn't know, is that our firm had been circling Weston Logistics for the better part of 4 months. A potential acquisition. Multi-million-dollar deal. And before any number gets put on a table, before any contract gets drafted, we do something that most firms don't publicly advertise. We watch, not surveillance. Nothing dramatic, just observation. How does a man behave when he thinks nothing is at stake? How does he treat people he believes are beneath him? What does he do when there's no deal on the line and no camera pointed at his face? Renee designed the process. She calls it the ambient audit. I call it, and I say this with complete professional sincerity, the most accurate assessment tool I have ever encountered in 15 years of finance. Vivian Alcott is a close personal friend of Sterling's. The party was not a coincidence. The 70 guests were not random. And Brett Weston's invitation had been very, very deliberate. I drove home that night with the windows down, the engine knocking its familiar rhythm, Laura's hand resting on my arm, as the Connecticut roads blurred dark and quiet around us. He was rude, Laura said finally. He was honest, I said. That's more useful. She looked at me. You have that look. What look? The one where you already know something the other person doesn't. I kept my eyes on the road. I kept my smile to myself. Because in exactly 72 hours, Brett Weston was going to walk into our boardroom for what he believed was the most important meeting of his career. And he had absolutely no idea that it had already begun. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. Let me tell you something about preparation. Most people prepare for the meeting they're walking into. They polish their shoes, they rehearse their numbers, they practice their handshake in the bathroom mirror and tell themselves tonight is the night everything changes. But the truly dangerous ones? They prepare for the meeting that already happened 3 days ago. I was already prepared. Monday morning arrived the way all consequential Mondays do, quietly, without announcement, like it had nothing to prove. I was at my desk by 7:15. Black coffee. No sugar. A legal pad with 3 columns of notes I'd been building since Saturday night. Renee had slid a fresh copy of Brett's file under my door, sometime before I arrived. She has a habit of doing that, appearing and disappearing like a ghost with a briefcase. And I'd spent the first 40 minutes of my morning reading it again. Not because I needed to. Because I wanted every number, every liability, every crack in the foundation of Weston Logistics living at the front of my mind when Brett Weston walked through that door. Sterling appeared in my doorway at 8 sharp, coffee in hand, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He confirmed, Sterling said. I know, I said. Sterling studied me for a moment with those sharp, unhurried eyes of his. 20 years in private equity had given the man a face that revealed absolutely nothing and absorbed absolutely everything. Renee told me about Saturday, he said. I looked up. Poverty stock, Sterling said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Barely, just barely, in what I had learned over 4 years to recognize as his version of a laugh. It's a good truck, I said. How'd you handle it? I smiled. Sterling nodded slowly, the way a man nods when an answer confirms exactly what he already believed. Good, he said. Then he straightened, pushed off the doorframe, and was gone. That was Sterling Hayes in his entirety. Economy of words. Maximum weight. At 9:45, Renee knocked twice and leaned into my office. Now, I want to take a moment here because if I don't describe Renee Fontaine properly, you won't fully appreciate what she brings to this story. Renee is the kind of woman who can walk into a room, say 4 words, and rearrange the entire power structure without anyone noticing it happened. She's been with the firm 11 years. She designed the ambient audit process herself after watching 3 acquisitions go sideways. Because the target's leadership turned out to be one kind of person in a boardroom and a completely different kind of person everywhere else. She takes it personally when people fail the audit. She took Saturday personally. He's downstairs, she said. Early? I asked. 8 minutes. She paused. He brought Tucker. I set my pen down. We didn't invite Tucker. No, Renee said. We did not. We looked at each other for a moment. Interesting, I said. Very, she said. And she was gone. I want to stop here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone walk into a trap they built themselves? Not a trap you set. Not something cruel or calculated with malice. But a situation where a person's own behavior, their own choices, their own words from 72 hours ago have quietly assembled themselves into a wall they're about to walk directly into. It is, and I say this with complete honesty, one of the most uncomfortable things I have ever witnessed. Because it's not satisfying the way movies make you think it will be. It's just clarifying. The boardroom at our firm is deliberately understated. No dramatic skyline view. No ego wall covered in plaques and magazine covers. Just a long oak table, 8 chairs, good lighting, and the kind of quiet that makes people want to fill it with words they probably shouldn't say. I was already seated when Brett and Tucker were shown in. Sterling sat at the head of the table. I sat to his right. Renee sat 2 seats down, a closed folder in front of her, a pen she wasn't using resting on top of it. Brett Weston walked in wearing a suit that cost more than my truck, which I suspect was intentional on some level I'll never be able to prove. His hair was perfect. His confidence was dialed to exactly the setting he'd had it on Saturday, that easy, slightly elevated self-assurance of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility that a room might not be impressed by him. He saw Sterling first, then his eyes moved to me, and there it was. That fraction of a second, that tiny, almost imperceptible flicker, where the brain processes something the face isn't ready to respond to yet. His smile stayed in place, but his eyes did something complicated. A rapid internal calculation running behind them. Wait, I know this man. Where do I know this man? The party, the truck. Why is he? Brett, Sterling said warmly, rising to shake his hand. Good of you for coming in. And you brought Tucker. We'll get him set up in the reception area. My assistant will take good care of him. That last part was delivered so smoothly, so graciously, that it took Tucker a full 3 seconds to understand he was being asked to leave the room. To his credit, he recovered with a nod and followed Sterling's assistant out without protest. Brett watched him go. Then he turned back to the table, and I watched him make a decision. The decision to pretend, to recalibrate, to act as though Saturday had either not happened or did not matter. He was good at it, I'll give him that. He sat down across from me, extended his hand with that too firm grip, and smiled like we were meeting for the first time. Blake, is it? He said. Blake Harrington, I said pleasantly. Good to see you again, Brett. Again. I let that word sit there on the table between us like a chess piece. His smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes did. Sterling opened the meeting with the precision of a man who has done this 1,000 times. Broad strokes first. The firm's acquisition philosophy. What we look for. What we don't. He was warm, professional, and completely in control, and Brett responded in kind. Articulate, prepared, clearly having rehearsed this pitch more than once. For 20 minutes it was almost normal. Then Renee opened her folder. Brett, she said, her voice carrying that particular quality of calm that is somehow more unnerving than sharpness. Before we get into the financials, we like to take a few minutes to talk about leadership culture. How a company's senior leadership conducts themselves. In the office, outside of it. The values that drive decision-making at every level. Brett nodded. Confidence. Absolutely. Culture is everything. We've built something really special at Weston. How do you treat people you consider beneath you? Renee asked. The room went very quiet. Brett blinked. I'm sorry. It's a straightforward question, Renee said, without an ounce of hostility. Just curiosity. Clean and direct. In your experience, how do you engage with people you perceive as being at a lower professional or financial level than yourself? Brett laughed. That same performance laugh from Saturday, slightly smaller this time, slightly less certain of its audience. I mean, with respect, obviously. I think everyone deserves. Because we were at Vivian Alcott's party on Saturday, I said. I said it quietly, conversationally, like I was mentioning the weather. Brett turned to look at me. And this time the flicker wasn't a flicker. It was a wave. It moved across his entire face. Cheekbones, jaw, the muscles around his eyes, before he locked it back down. Right, he said carefully. Small world, isn't it? I said. Sterling leaned forward, folded his hands on the table, and looked at Brett with an expression of genuine, almost paternal interest. Brett, I'm going to be straightforward with you because I think you're a smart man, and smart men appreciate directness. He paused. We've been observing Weston Logistics for about 4 months. The numbers are interesting. The growth trajectory is real. The operational debt is manageable. Another pause. But we don't just acquire companies. We acquire leadership. And leadership, in our experience, is not what a man does in a boardroom. Silence. It's what he does when he thinks no one important is watching. Brett Weston sat very, very still. And for the first time since I'd met him, at the party, in this room, across any version of any interaction we'd ever had, he had absolutely nothing to say. I looked at him sitting there in his expensive suit, with his rehearsed numbers and his too-firm handshake, and his word, poverty stock, still hanging somewhere in the air between Connecticut and this oak table, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that, something that only comes when silence finally cashes out. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you for real. Let me tell you something about the moment before everything changes. It doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic music, no slow motion, no convenient lightning bolt from the sky to mark the occasion. It's just a room, a table, a few people breathing the same air, and one man sitting across from you who is finally, for the first time, completely and utterly himself. Because there is nothing left to perform. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted, not because I am dramatic, well, maybe a little, but because in rooms like ours, silence has weight, and weight has meaning, and I've learned to measure both. Brett Weston sat with his hands flat on the table, his perfectly rehearsed pitch somewhere behind him, in a pile of suddenly useless preparation. And he looked at Sterling Hayes the way men look at a situation, when they realize the map they brought doesn't match the territory they're standing in. Then he did something I did not expect. He laughed. Not the performance laugh. Not the one from the party, loud, calculated, pulling an audience like a magnet pulling metal. This one was smaller, quieter, the kind of laugh a man exhales when he's caught and he knows it, and fighting it would only make the whole thing more embarrassing. The truck, he said. Not a question, a statement, an arrival. The truck, I confirmed. He rubbed the back of his neck, looked at the table, then back up at me. That was... He started, then stopped. Started again. That wasn't my finest moment. Now here's where I want you to pay very close attention, because what happened next is the part of this story that I did not see coming. The part that changed not just the outcome of the meeting, but the way I think about people entirely. Sterling Hayes, the man who built a private equity firm on silence and precision, and 20 years of watching human beings reveal themselves under pressure. Sterling Hayes leaned back in his chair, looked at Brett Weston and said, "Tell me about your father." I glanced at Sterling. He wasn't looking at me. Brett blinked. I'm sorry? Your father? Sterling said simply. Tell me about him. Like a man who had prepared for every version of this meeting except the one where someone asked him something real. He was a mechanic, Brett said slowly. Small shop, outside of Hartford. He worked 6 days a week for 31 years. Said nothing. He drove an old truck, Brett said, and something in his voice shifted. Almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. The way you catch a change in temperature before you can explain why you're suddenly cold. Ford. Beat up, embarrassed the hell out of me as a kid. The room was absolutely still. When your friends came over? Sterling asked. When anyone came over, Brett said quietly. I used to pray he'd park it around the block. Nobody spoke. Brett looked up at me then, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was nothing behind his eyes except the thing that was actually there. He passed 4 years ago, Brett said. I drive a car that costs more per month than he made in a year. He paused. I don't know when that stopped feeling like success and started feeling like... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I sat with that for a moment. Because here's the thing about people. Here is the complicated, frustrating, humbling thing about human beings that no amount of financial modeling or ambient auditing or 15 years of professional experience fully prepares you for. Sometimes the cruelest thing a person says is just the loudest thing they're ashamed of. Renee closed her folder. I noticed it immediately because Renee does nothing accidentally. Every gesture, every pause, every click of a pen is deliberate. And closing that folder meant something. It meant she was done collecting data. Sterling straightened in his chair, which was his version of a gear shift, the meeting moving from one phase to the next. "Brett," he said, "I'm going to tell you something and I need you to hear it clearly." Brett nodded. Saturday was a problem. Not because Blake is sensitive. He is genuinely the least sensitive man I've ever employed, and that is meant as a compliment. Sterling glanced at me briefly, and I appreciated the accuracy. But because how a man treats people he thinks don't matter tells us everything about how he'll treat people when the stakes are real. Employees, partners, vendors, people inside your organization who will never sit at this table but whose work holds the whole thing up. Brett absorbed this without defense, which itself was information. "You have a good company," Sterling continued. "The bones are solid, the growth is real. But a company is only ever as good as the culture at the top, and culture starts with one thing: character." Brett nodded slowly. The expensive suit suddenly looked less like armor and more like clothes. "So here's where we are," Sterling said. "We're not making a decision today." Brett looked up. "We're going to take 30 days. During that time, Renee is going to have 3 conversations with your senior leadership team. Separately, informally, nothing alarming. Blake is going to visit your Stamford office twice, unscheduled. And at the end of 30 days, we'll sit back down. And if," Brett started, "and if what we find matches what I'm choosing to believe about you based on the last 4 minutes," Sterling said, "then we'll talk numbers." The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Sterling walked Brett to the elevator himself. Another deliberate move, his way of saying this isn't over, it's just beginning. And I stayed at the table with Renee, the two of us in the particular quiet that follows a room that's held a lot of tension. Renee picked up her pen, uncapped it, recapped it. "That was not the ending I designed," she said. "No," I agreed. "I had a full termination sequence prepared. 3 slides. I know." I saw the folder. "Sterling," I said, "wrote a different script halfway through and didn't tell either of us." Renee considered this. "The father, the truck." She paused. "Did you know?" Then, almost to herself, "People are exhausting." "Yeah," I said. "They really are." I left the office at 6:15. My truck was in the parking structure on level 2, exactly where I'd left it. Faded navy, electrical tape on the mirror, that diagonal crack in the windshield that I kept telling Laura I'd fix. I sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. I thought about Brett's father, a mechanic outside Hartford, 6 days a week, 31 years, an old Ford truck that his son used to pray would park around the block. I thought about my own father, a man who worked nights at a shipping facility in Ohio, who drove a rusted Chevy that wheezed at intersections, who told me once, when I was 9 years old and embarrassed to be dropped off at school in it, "Blake, the truck gets you there. That's the whole job. Don't confuse the vehicle with the destination." I never forgot that. I think maybe Brett Weston forgot it somewhere along the way. And I think Saturday, at Vivian Alcott's garden party, standing in front of 70 guests with a drink in his hand and a performance to maintain, some part of him remembered. I called Laura on the drive home. She picked up on the second ring the way she always does, like she was already nearby. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Complicated," I said. "Good complicated or bad complicated." I thought about Brett's face when he said he passed 4 years ago. I thought about Sterling going off script. I thought about Renee closing her folder. "Human complicated," I said. Laura was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm good." "Did you get him?" I smiled. "Sterling's giving him 30 days. So that's a maybe." "That's a maybe," I agreed. Another pause. Then Laura said, "Blake, you took the truck to a meeting where you were evaluating a man who insulted your truck." "I did. That is either the most petty thing you've ever done or the most brilliant." "Laura," I said completely seriously, "those two things are not mutually exclusive." And I drove home through the Connecticut evening with the windows down and the engine knocking its familiar rhythm and that crack still running diagonally across the lower left of my windshield. I never did fix it. 30 days later, we sat back down with Brett Weston. Renee's conversations with his leadership team revealed a man his employees described as demanding but fair, occasionally difficult, occasionally surprising, the kind of boss who remembered birthdays and forgot to say thank you and sometimes did both on the same day. Human, in other words. The numbers worked. The terms were agreed. The acquisition moved forward. On the day contracts were signed, Brett Weston walked into the lobby and found me waiting with 2 cups of coffee. We rode the elevator up together in the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who have already seen each other clearly. Just before the doors opened, he said without looking at me, "For what it's worth, it's a good truck." "I know," I said. The doors opened. We walked in, and that was that. Here's what I want you to take from this story. Not the acquisition, not the boardroom, not the satisfaction of a man being held accountable by his own words. I want you to take the truck, because the truck was never about poverty. It was never about status or success or what you drive versus what you're worth. The truck was about what a man reveals when he thinks the stakes are low, when he thinks nobody important is watching, when he thinks the room he's standing in doesn't count. Every room counts. Every person counts. And silence, real, patient, deliberate silence, is never the absence of power. It is power. Waiting for the right moment to speak. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.